Welcome tonight as we have a discussion on Christopher Schroeder's new book, Startup Rising, The Entrepreneurial Revolution and Remaking of the Middle East. It's a very timely look at the surge of entrepreneurship sweeping the Middle East and why the West should consider the potential hidden opportunities behind the daily reports of violence and chaos and crisis that we hear every single day in the region. Now, I'm going to give a brief summary of Chris's extensive resume. While I'm doing so, I just ask you to check your phones and make sure that they're on silent. I'd appreciate it. Chris graduated magna cum laude from the Harvard College and with honors from the Harvard Business School. And since then, he's become a leading internet entrepreneur and venture investor in interactive technologies and social communications. He is both an investor and advisor for a series of technology startups and funds, including news and media, education, social networks, and marketing. He's also engaged in exploring global trends towards entrepreneurship with a special focus on the Middle East, which we're going to hear about tonight. Now, let me just hit home on just a few of some of his impressive accomplishments. He's the former CEO of Health Central Com. That was a collection of condition and wellness-specific interactive experiences that focused on people finding and sharing real-time experiences related to their health needs. And just to give you an example, just to give you a metric on how popular this was, over 16.4 million users visited this site every month. He also served as the CEO and publisher of Washington Post.Newsweek Interactive, which hosts WashingtonPost.com, Newsweek and MSNBC.com, among other leading news sites. And prior to doing this, Chris was a partner in the Thayer Capital Partners, a leading private equity company in Washington, D.C., with the investment bank Salomon Brothers in New York, focusing on corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions for a wide range of Fortune 500 companies. He also has extensive government experience. He was a leading management role in the President George Bush's 1988 and 1992 election campaigns, and he worked on Secretary of State James Baker's staff, and then Undersecretary and currently President of the World Bank, or the former President of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick. He's won numerous awards, including Pharma Voice, Top 100 Most Inspiring People in Life Sciences. He was also one of the first interactive executives named to the American Advertising Hall of Achievement, which is a national annual award honoring a leading executive. And he was named one of the top business executives in Business Forward Media and the Washingtonian. So we are very, very pleased to sponsor this event and listen to Chris, and moderating the event tonight is Nate Fick. Now, when I took over as the Undersecretary of the Navy, the position had been gapped for 2.5 years. It was pretty easy to move into that job because no one really had anything to compare me against. Following Nate Fick, wow, what a hard time. Everyone knows Nate. He's just an enormously capable person, now the CEO of Endgame Incorporated, which is a venture-backed security intelligence and software company. He has a long-time affiliation with CNAS from the very birth of our company. First as a fellow, then as CEO, then as the Chief Executive Officer, and I replaced Nate, and man, his shoes are very, very big and hard to fill. He himself is an author of the New York Times best-selling book, One Bullet Away, The Making a Marine Officer, which went over his time as a Marine, detailing the experiences at the basic school and deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as a Marine myself, it is one hell of a book. So we're very pleased tonight to have both Nate and Chris with us. And please join me in welcoming them both to this event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Bob, very much. It's personal pleasure for me to share the stage this evening with Chris at a CNAS event. This is one of those moments when threads in life converge in one place. In addition to having been CEO of CNAS for 4 years and affiliated with the place for 7, I've been friends with Chris for nearly as long, and he's been a great mentor to me. So this is a real treat for me personally, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I got to say as well that our timing and context are pretty good. It struck me as I was walking down the street, the DC police made me cross the street as I came by the Willard, and then I got patted down coming in the door and given the hairy eyeball because we have a Middle Eastern head of state apparently in the building, or we did a little while ago. And all of that fit my own narrative bias about the Middle East. I thought, yeah, this seems about right. Very little of what Chris writes about in Startup Rising fits my narrative bias. It challenges all my assumptions. And so, Chris, maybe you can just talk with us a little bit to start about how the book has challenged people to get out of their own buckets.
Well, firstly, just to add to all the wonderful things said, it's an honor to be here with you and to have been with all you. I mean, in a way, if there's any think tank, if that's the best way to describe CNAS, I don't even want to put it in a bucket, but getting out of narratives, compelling people to think outside of their boxes has been, I think, the hallmark of you all, and it's just been wonderful to be affiliated with you. And I am not surprised that you were willing to at least open yourselves up to a discussion about this before. And a way to talk about the narrative bias, even in my own experience, is a kind of aha moment, because Maliki is here, and so that's an issue. And we've been reading the news about Iraq this summer, which has not been good. Obviously, we're here. But how many of us would know that one of the largest initial public offerings, that when a company sells stock to the public and then raises capital to move forward, was AsiaCell, which is the Iraqi mobile provider, which went public at a valuation in excess of $5 billion, and in fact has been growing since. And in a way, that sort of captures that there are many things going on in the world of great complexity, where very terrible things and narratives that we know so well in the 20th century, it's not that they're irrelevant and not there, but something else that is happening just as powerfully. This book is, in many ways, a story of my narrative bias. And in a way, I should be more ashamed of it than almost anyone else, because I've traveled all over the world. I've run many technology companies. I have seen what technology has done firsthand in South America and Asia, India, Israel, assuredly. I've outsourced technology to almost every emerging market, but I could not get my mind around Mubarak's Egypt kicking up an ecosystem of the same. And it was when I began to become introduced to this that the aha moment was, of course, why would it be any different? Every emerging market has significant challenges, much history to overcome. But when people have access to technology on a day-to-day basis at scale that works, they tend to do some pretty remarkable things with it, notwithstanding that.
So let's talk for a minute about technology at scale. We're moving rapidly toward a world described by Mark Andreessen, who wrote the foreword to Startup Rising, a great founder, one of the best technology investors of our time. And Mark talks about a world of 5 billion smartphones being a fundamentally different planet.
Yeah, it has to be a fundamentally different planet because, just to put it in perspective, in most emerging markets, but certainly in emerging markets in the Middle East, it is not uncommon to find 140% mobile usage, which means that people on average have more than one phone, by definition. And this is technology, right? This is very interesting. People are doing amazing things with it, even basic texting capability. I mean, many of you know, and if you're not, you'll be intrigued to find out that the largest mobile payment country on the planet, in aggregate dollars, not per capita, is Kenya. 20% of the entire GDP of Kenya passes through a dumb phone texting capability called M-Pesa. This was a country that had no banking, for all intents and purposes, and the ability to have even the simplest transaction over 10 or 20 miles was all but impossible until this was developed. So you can do amazing things with that. But what Mark is raising is something very, very different. Every mobile provider that I interviewed for the book told me that, say, for example, in Egypt alone, that within the next 2 years, 3 years, there's going to be 50% smartphone penetration, smartphone usage in Egypt. And to put that in perspective, in many of the Gulf countries right now, it's already higher than that. Andreessen, too, you said in my book, states that there'll be 5 billion in 8 to 10 years. Now, I think a lot of us think that smartphones are effectively highfalutin phones, better things that you can play with and do. And I would suggest, I don't know how many BlackBerry users are here, but I would suggest to you RIM, the manufacturer of BlackBerry, made that same mistake, that all it was about better features. Because while smartphones do have better features, while smartphones do allow us to watch video and do very interesting things, this device that I'm holding in my hand right now, as many of you know, has the same computing power in this device that all of NASA had to put a man on the moon in 1969. So the interesting question looking forward is, what is a world going to look like if Mark is right and 2/3 of humanity is walking around with a supercomputer in their pockets? And that is a definite different proposition in terms of problem solving and in terms of potential of innovation.
So that's a state of the world, a comment on the state of the world. What about the ecosystems required to make this sort of entrepreneurship successful? You quote Ben Horowitz talking about what makes Silicon Valley special or makes it possible. Is it unique? If not, what should we be looking for as the leading indicators or the enablers of this kind of innovation?
Conventional wisdom, which like most conventional wisdom I think has just simple basis in fact, is that ecosystems, the term that we use a lot in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, which is just the environment of rule of law, of government, of educational institutions, of research, of the ability just for people and ideas to move, is incredibly important and has historically come top-down. It's been driven by government policymakers and larger top-down institutions. And there's no question that the absence of this in many emerging markets, and particularly in the Arab world, is a challenge. What has been so fascinating to me over the last few years of spending time over there is how much of an ecosystem, because of these devices, is actually coming bottom up. That the very act of people having access to these devices where they can collaborate, see how each other lives, see the way the rest of the world lives. I mean, really stop and think about what I'm about to say. They essentially have all of the world's knowledge at their fingertips, essentially for free, have been this amazing autodidact capability of connectivity and learning and sharing that has made many of these phenomenons happen bottom up. Whether the 20th century paradigm of top-down institutionalism, both in government and big business, and this phenomenon which will only increase over time, as I agree with Mark, whether they go at loggerheads or whether at one point the big institutions realize there's something here to support with great ramification, I don't have a crystal ball. But what I can say is that there are opportunities available, both bottom-up and top-down, that we couldn't even have talked about if we were sitting here 5 years ago.
So let's talk about government for a minute. Can government help?
Sure, I think government can help a tremendous amount, not unlike what I'm talking about, but government should help in very concrete ways that are adherent to the bottom-up phenomenon. So in other words, governments like to speechify about, it's an in thing to give speeches about entrepreneurship now, and governments will hold these big gatherings of people that are very expensive and very elaborate and really don't have a whole lot of bearing on the day-to-day needs of what people need. Now, some of it, of course, is infrastructural, right? The education system is a challenge, which I want to come back to separately, if I could, as a section. Roads don't work in some cases, all these things that we know so well in emerging markets. But very easy, quick fix things in the areas of rule of law and the movement of people and ideas is actually incredibly easy to fix if there was a willingness to do it. So I'll give you a very concrete example. Among the most exciting types of companies, now I'll talk solely as a businessman, if I may, for a minute, are e-commerce companies in the Arab world. To put it in a little bit of perspective, there's probably $1 billion in revenue moving in e-commerce companies right now in the Arab world, and this is in a region that has probably over 450 billion in retail sales. So there's an enormous opportunity, for this to happen and become much bigger overall. And I think it's very exciting. But to move goods from one place to another is unbelievably difficult just because of basic regulation. So literally, in some cases, it's easier to ship something from New York to Dubai and from Dubai to Amman than it is to go from Amman directly. So as one friend said to me, imagine if Jeff Bezos tried to start Amazon with 50 states with their all regulatory bodies, collecting fees, inspectors and all. It's an unnecessary millstone on the way to this. But clear that out, and the flourishing opportunities you have are amazing. And so it's not a surprise that the GCC, which as many of you know better than I now includes Morocco and Jordan, is actually spending time trying to figure out if at least they can do some streamlining within their region. And that's not hard to do, except it is hard to do in terms of the legacies and traditions. But the multiplier impact and the signal that that would send to its ecosystem, I think would be like lightning in a bottle.
So one of the cool things about the book, I thought, was you alternate from painting a picture of the world and then drilling in on individuals and telling personal stories of people who have overcome long odds, as all entrepreneurs do, but even longer odds than most, given the context in which they're doing it. Tell us a story. Talk to us about one of these young entrepreneurs or a young company that's especially exciting to you.
It's almost an impossible question in a way, because I was so intrigued, not only as a person curious about the world, but even as an investor, to see the capability and drive and determination and ground understanding that so many of these entrepreneurs made. There is sort of at a macro level a phenomenon, the economy, the statistics aren't that great, but take it as an index if nothing else. But The Economist reported this summer that 1/3 of the startup entrepreneurs in the Middle East are women. Now, who would think that? Except that in every event and every gathering I went to, it would confirm that absolutely. But if I had to pick, a guy, there's this amazing young man. He's 26 years old now, and he came from one of the refugee areas of Amman, Jordan, and we'll talk a little bit about Rawad and other things that helped get him to where he was. But he's just, when you meet a woman or man like this, you know, as a friend of mine said, that either you'll back this company or you'll back the second company, doesn't matter. At some point, they're going to get it right. Total curiosity, utter tenacity, simply will walk through walls and make things happen. A high, actually, sense of character and integrity, and just a sponge. And a phenomenal young man named Ala Ansal. And he had this dream. He believes that we're about to enter a golden age of reading in Arabic in the Middle East. 9 to 10% of the entire internet is comprised of people who are also Arabic speakers, and yet only 1% of the content available is in Arabic. And he thinks that this is going to change rapidly because of technology. And the son of a gun is building effectively the Amazon bookseller, just in books right now, for the Middle East. He has over 9 million titles now on his platform. He's raised at multi-million-dollar valuations, $500,000 to build it, and is just moving rapidly and just doesn't give in. And I can't tell you whether he'll make it, but there's no way on earth that a young kid from a refugee camp in Amman, from the wrong side of Amman, would have had an opportunity like this if we were talking about it some years ago.
So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the ecosystems that enable this sort of entrepreneurship, a little bit about the general technology trends. What's your view on the future of technology? Is it unalloyed good? Is it agnostic? I think that there's maybe before the so-called Arab Spring, there was maybe a little bit more optimism in the United States that access to technology was going to unleash, all sorts of wonderful things. And now, maybe there's a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of a sense that the technology is agnostic and it's simply a tool that can be used by repressive regimes as easily as by young people or people fighting for a different way of life. How do you think about this?
Look, I mean, what technology has not been a tool of good and bad in the history of man, ever? Go back to Roman times and everything else. That's the double-edged sword of technology, in a way. I mean, for those of you who remember the wonderful play Inherit the Wind, which is about the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow. There's this wonderful monologue that the Darrow figure has, that life is a trade-off at times like this. When scientific knowledge comes, you always have to pay something for when you get it, right? Yes, we can have the airplane, but the birds will lose their wonder and the clouds will smell of gasoline, right? I mean, this is part of what we live in. But what I am so excited about in this technology and its diffusion, while people will abuse it, both bottom up and top down, and we see evidence of it everywhere, including, dare I say, in our backyard. But the nature of it, which is its transparency and demand for transparency, the speed with which it moves, the ability to be almost compelled to see so many other perspectives and some other ways of building and creating and innovating, that when someone solves a problem in Uganda, someone in Egypt can immediately pick up on it and find ways to make it theirs within their experience. We've never seen anything like that. And while some terrible things will assuredly come with it, with privacy, or bad guys using it in terrible ways who will have to continue to kill to stop them doing what they do, I think the idea that 5 billion people are solving problems, we've always known in aid, just to use this as an example, that the people on the ground know more than anything. I mean, our top-down institutions here in Washington tend to think that we here have all the expertise and the understanding how to solve their problems. But the folks who are serious about this knows that the best problem solving comes from the people who have to live with it on a day-to-day basis. So imagine now that they've got the capacity to not only do it right in their backyard, but within a broader geography, and anything they do that's successful, other people can have access to it. I think the net positives are truly worth consideration in that trade-off.
So your book focuses on the Middle East, but this suggests that it's a global phenomenon. What do you see happening in the cities of Africa or Latin America or less developed parts of Asia?
So there are a couple of things to talk about. I mean, obviously, it's absolutely, wherever anyone has access to this capabilities, magic happens, right? I mean, I used the example of Kenya before, and that's an obvious example of this. But in Uganda, I know people in India that are using texting capabilities to effectively be gatherers of reports about things like corruption and sexual abuse and that kind of stuff. That pops up now in all sorts of different parts of the world. But people are using it in everything. A lot of times when people hear the word technology, Nate, they say, well, okay, this is something highfalutin. This has nothing to do with the masses. This is like the elite will figure this one out. And what they forget is what I said before, which is 140% mobile penetration. If you are a woman who has made a little bit of a living in crafts, and all of a sudden you have a mobile phone, you're moving those crafts somewhere where you could never move them before. And then when you have access to a platform, there are a whole series of these Etsy-like craft platforms that women in relatively poor areas of Cairo are able to put up their things. They're selling goods to parts of the world they never could before. And you see, I can't think of an example of the world where this technology is available. I mean, maybe it's not happening in North Korea, but I can't think of a part of the world that I've been where it's not happening, which is, again, why it was such a narrative check in my gut when I was in the Arab world. I mean, really, when I went to this gathering in Dubai in 2010, which was one of the first large gatherings of technology startups in the Arab world. And so it was 2,400 people from North Africa to Yemen with a 2,000-person waiting list. And I got off the plane and I just watched the energy going on. Nobody wanted to talk about President Obama's Cairo speech. Nobody cared about anything other than building stuff and solving problems. And I thought to myself, I'm an idiot. It's happening everywhere. I've seen it everywhere, so this is where we are.
What's motivating the entrepreneurs you talk to in the Middle East?
In what way?
I think if you talk to some of the best technology entrepreneurs in America, almost none of them are motivated by money.
Yeah, good for you.
Almost none of them are motivated by notoriety. They tend to be motivated, I think, by a desire to change the world in some way.
Yeah, I think there's a wonderful quote in my book. It's interesting. One of the most interesting series of interviews that I did, the best interviews are on the ground in the Middle East with these great young people and the supporters and people getting in their way. But it was fascinating to spend 2 weeks in Silicon Valley with my friends out there and effectively asking them how are they thinking about emerging markets. And I got this shockingly backward-looking and highly me focused answer, which was, to them, emerging markets are really about, is the market size so big that I've got to be there, me, someday I'll make money. Is labor so cheap there that I can outsource there more cost-effectively, me. But the idea that this innovation could be something that raises boats that they were mixed on until, at one point, one of the great venture capitalists turned to me and said, you know, though, come to think of it, wherever I've been in the world, when I'm in a room of entrepreneurs, doesn't matter their race, sex, creed, color, where they're from, they are the same people. And it goes to the answer to your question. They're just instant curiosity, instant problem solvers, instant wanting just to make things that were not there before. Some of them have ambition. I mean, a lot of them have ambitions to make wealth. I mean, we should talk a little bit about this because this is a region with a huge youth bubble that needs jobs, right? And some of that is inspiring. They've given up on jobs coming from anywhere else, so some of this certainly has an economic incentive to it. But to your point, when great entrepreneurs are together, they want to walk through walls and make something happen that was not there before. And that you see that everywhere that you go in the Arab world with this community.
So in this sense, the youth bubble is almost a better problem to have than the demographic challenges of, say, Japan.
So I believe that very firmly. I mean, the aging population, many of you are Asia experts and would have much greater data and insight into than I do, but I would rather, all things being equal, have a youth population that I need to figure out than an aging population where you need to figure out something, but it's not about growth and it's not about development necessarily as much. But having said that, a youth bubble is a two-edged sword as well, because you have this talent and opportunity, but you have a youth bubble, and in many of the countries in the Arab world, 50% of the population are under 30, under 25, depending where you are. If they have 25, 30%, 40% unemployment, we all know what that looks like, right? That's a terrible kind of outcome as well. And the education system and the illiteracy rates in these are terrible and very serious in many areas. But I have yet to have an economist who has explained to me any path of traditional business or traditional government addressing any of that. And it is unbelievably exciting to watch young people who look at infrastructure problems where people my age and older would say it's going to take a generation to fix, and say, oh, no, this is a software problem. I'm going to come up with a solution to fix it, whether it be in education or navigation of traffic or security, and making that happen. And I think we should be spending as much, if not more time, thinking about how we can be helpful to that as we are about thinking about the traditional hand-wringing that it's going to take 30 years to do something. Because I'll tell you, if you spend any time with these entrepreneurs, and if you even spend 15 seconds talking about this will be fine, but it's going to take 20 years to do it, they just shut off. They're not even angry. Their eyes glaze over and they move to a different room, because that's not the way that they're viewing the world.
Let's spend a minute on how the investment actually works. Where does the growth capital come from in these companies, because in the United States, most of the early stage venture money is coming from the United States. And much of it is coming from entrepreneurs who have built companies and then gone on to fund others. I'm thinking about Mark Andreessen, for instance, and his partner Ben Horowitz. I'm thinking about Peter Thiel, thinking about Jeff Bezos. Is the early stage venture money in the Middle East coming from the Middle East, or is it coming from, say, the United States?
So the investment part of this is a big challenge as well, but of course I have a hopeful ending with it, right? So the challenge is that there is not this culture or tradition. There has been in the Arab world some tradition, and I wouldn't even say it's been overly large or successful, and it's been limited usually to a handful of players, but there has absolutely been a tradition of private equity. Later stage companies with cash flow, you know, even when they call things SME, small, medium enterprises, you're talking about 50 million in revenue, 100 million in revenue, whatever. And these have been able to get funding and have been very intriguing to a lot of investors around the world as well as investors there. In the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a real rise in what we all call here angel investing, which is early $10,000, $20,000, $15,000, $100,000 investments, which has been useful. And a lot of that's come from the region, and some of it has come from other people who've been interested in it. Okay, good start. The challenge that they've run into is what we in the Valley call the A round, which you know about. I mean, it's that where you're now successful enough that you need $1 million, $2 million, or $3 million, and that's still nascent, and it's a real problem. Because there's nothing more discouraging than to get where you think you need to be and you look around to take it to the next place and you can't do it. So what ends up happening? And what ends up happening is maybe 2 or 3 really important things. One, I know A rounds that are being raised as we speak right now. Secondly, some Western investors in the A round stage, like General Atlantic out of London, Kleiner Perkins, have taken toeholds in places like Istanbul with a willingness to take a look at this region, obviously back on their heels with recent political instability, but are certainly curious about it. You see a phenomenon of what Linda Rotenberg of Endeavor Global, which is a mind-blowing nonprofit that's helping global entrepreneurship around the world at scale. She calls it E to E, emerging market to emerging market. So there have actually been some interesting investments coming from NASPers from South Africa, places from India and others who are all shaping around and trying to figure out opportunities. It has been frustrating that a lot of it yet, I think it's about to change, but a lot of it yet has not come from the region. As one very honest investor there told me, the good news is in the Middle East there's plenty of money. We can fund this ecosystem. The bad news is it's in our pocket. And the cultural, psychological willingness, you know, it's one thing to turn to your friends and say, look at the new 4 Seasons I just built. It's another thing to say, I'm about to invest in a portfolio who by definition, 70% of it's going to go to zero, which is what the essence of risk capital is. And so this is moving slowly. You know, when the Prince Alawid put in $300 million into Twitter, you can bet Twitter lit up with the entrepreneurs in the region all saying, okay, our turn, what about us, and all. This is the other thing which is, I think, becoming interesting to watch. As some of the newer generation becomes successful, like the founder of the Yahoo of the Middle East is called, he's Sami Toukan, but his company is called Maktub, and Yahoo bought it for almost $200 million. He made a determination that he's going to put this money back into the next thing. So he built something called Jabbar Capital. He's brought in Tiger to help invest in it. He has spun off a bunch of entrepreneurs who are now starting other companies. He's got a significant investment in a company called Souk.com, which is effectively the Amazon of the Middle East, probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is what in the States they call, you'll remember, Nate, the PayPal effect, which is, you know, PayPal gets bought for a whole lot of money. It's got a whole lot of rich people in it. It also has a lot of people who do not want to work for a big company, and they shoot off other entrepreneurs. And you get this flywheel effect, both of ideation and of money, which I think we're seeing the earliest signs of it. No guarantees, but at least I find it encouraging.
Sure. Saw it in this area with AOL, right?
Same thing. Perfect example.
So last question for me before we go to the audience. Chris has always been motivated by the ideas of our time, and we talked about these entrepreneurs being motivated by something other than financial gain. I note in the book that you're giving all your proceeds to an organization called Rawad.
Yes.
And I think this crowd should know something about Rawad. And I encourage you all, with the holidays coming up, to go buy a pile of books and know that this guy isn't taking home a nickel.
I'm not taking home a nickel. And the book is over there, and buy many, because all the holidays are coming. And I think it was very important to do this. I actually have no investments in the region. I don't intend to have any. This will be the nonprofit part of my life. I think it was very important for me, particularly in writing the book, to be as arm's length as I possibly could so that I could report out. This is a hopeful book, but it is not a rah-rah book. It talks a lot about the deep challenges and a lot of the conflict and issues that come up and around it, but it is hopeful. Rawad is a mind blow. It was one of the first corporate social responsibility efforts, in a way, founded by a business executive some of you may know, who really is kind of in a league of his own. His name is Fadi Gondor. And he himself was an entrepreneur in the Middle East when there were not a lot of entrepreneurs. In fact, he himself said he never thought of himself as an entrepreneur until maybe 10 years ago. But he built this company called Aramex, which is effectively the FedEx of the Middle East and Africa. He gets pissed off at me when I make analogies, but that's the best way to describe it very quickly. And it's a multi-billion-dollar company that has gone public, and he's been successful with it. But his view is that there's something happening bigger than anything we've ever known in our lifetimes, bigger than '67, bigger than anything else in terms of what is reshaping the Middle East. And he thinks that there are a couple of things that are necessary. One is to support the ecosystem of startups I've talked about. And he's investing literally small amounts of money in hundreds of them. And he's raising funds and he's doing other things just to keep giving back into this and to mentor young people and drive his experiences in many very powerful ways. But Rawad, 10 years ago, maybe more now, I think they just had their 10th anniversary. So before corporate social responsibility was a buzzword, he was adamant, I mean, I've read the documents of the time, that our society is only as good as our society at whole. And the idea that the refugees in Jabal Nadif in Amman are somebody else's problem when they live in our backyard is just crazy. Because if you don't build up opportunity and realize that there's talent everywhere, you'll pay a price for it on the downside and you'll miss opportunity on the upside in terms of the kind of society you want to build. So Rawad is effectively, I mean, it's hard to describe it because at its easiest level, it's a youth center in Amman. But two really important things about it. One, there are no giveaways. He triggered it off. He's brought in resources to help generate different ideas within it. He brings in a lot of very talented young women and men from around Jordan so that young people can see people that they could become and the value of an education, all that basic stuff. But no one gets to use Rawad if they don't give back. Doesn't matter what it is. If you take a jacket, you give 10 hours of volunteer time. If someone is tutoring on this, you tutor on that. It's got a marvelous computer center, and that's one of the reasons why Allah, who I described before, who ended up building Jamalon, eyes were completely rocked by this experience. And other young people have been able to do things with it as well. But the really revolutionary thing, which floored me beyond anything, is a view that all these resources can be nice, all the connectivity is nice, but one of the things that is so important is developing a sense of citizenship, a sense of society. And so what they do, and forgive me those of you who speak Arabic, but they do something every Saturday called Dardashat, which is kind of a gathering. And they take the adolescents of the community. It can be as many as 100 or more at a time, sometimes it's smaller. But it's women and men, adolescents, who sit in tables of maybe 6 to 8, maybe 10. And they just go over case studies of day-to-day life. A woman walks down the street, a man catcalls her. Stop. What does that mean? You, young man, why did you do that? What were you thinking? Would you have done it if it was your sister? Does Islam say you should do that? What do you think of that person? Do you think she wanted you to do that? Woman, how do you feel about it? How did you feel when he did that? Well, I'm used to it. It happens all the time. Should that be acceptable? I've never understood it's acceptable, but what can I do? And then the conversations go. And they get into incredibly rich, real issues day to day of things like sexual abuse, views of religion, should you cover, should you, it's all open. But it's all open to the level that the folks in the community want to take it. And so the issues are, more than anything else, really, how should we talk to each other? How can a lot of folks, we take it for granted, or at least hopefully most of us take it for granted, that walking around in another person's shoes is a good thing. But it's actually taught as well. And so this is the concept that they've been developing there. We're hoping to open one in Tripoli. It's on hold, I think, briefly because of the border issues, of course, with Syria. There is one in Budros, which I think is very exciting in Palestine. There's one in a very poor sort of quote-unquote illegal community I visited of terrible poverty in Cairo. And let me just tell you, Nate, if there were 1,000 of these, and between what I'm seeing and this, it would be an incredible world indeed. But anyway, that's why you should buy my book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And now the floor's open. We have microphones going around. I ask only the people wait for the... Do we have mics? Yes. So we have a mic. Just wait for the mic, please, because we're recording. And if I could ask you to identify yourself and just make sure it ends in a question mark, that would be great.
That would be great.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Kevin Murphy, HBS 82. It's good to see the school focusing on entrepreneurship these days, as it didn't before.
It didn't, you're right.
And president of J. Austin. I've started up 5 companies and 1 NGO. Some years ago, we were asked by the Obama administration to send out the first entrepreneur in residence to Egypt. So Mike Ducker was out there and all of a sudden getting all kinds of kids together and and entrepreneurship boot camps and getting him in front of angel investors, and I think you were out there with him and saw some of that. I'd just like you to comment, if you would, on can U.S. foreign assistance be effective in promoting an entrepreneurship ecosystem? Although, believe me, I can tell you, it's really hard to get people to focus on that in the government. I mean, there's been lots of barriers. But was it, I want your opinion. You were out there, you saw it. Was it working, and can it work in other countries?
You know, it's a marvelous question. Let me just say that Mike Ducker is a hero. In fact, not only is he a hero just in a macro sense of his commitment and dedication, that I made a very conscious decision that actually ticked off a few Americans, but I made a very conscious decision not to talk about what we do there. So I acknowledge some of them, including Mike in my book, as an acknowledgement, but I don't tell their stories because I want this to be not about us. I want this to be about an understanding in my own way, best way to convey it of that way. But the opportunity is unbelievable, I think, because I can tell you, and you know, I'm in a microcosm, and many of you have studied the Middle East for many years, you may have a different view, but in my view of an experience there, let us just say this is not the high watermark of our popularity in the region. It's tough. I had a lot of experiences in this. But the same person who might heap abuse on me for decades of misfiring of American policy wanted to find out how I could help them connect with people in Silicon Valley. What book am I reading? What are the 5 best blogs that are coming from startup and entrepreneurs here? On and on and on and on, with an unbelievable level of excitement, right? So the potential of engagement is important, but the way to do it perfectly wrong is a way that many of our diplomats have done it over there, and very senior executives, senior government people have done, which is to say something like this: we're so proud of what you're doing in entrepreneurship. In fact, we all in here in this room know that entrepreneurship is the #1 export of the United States. Try saying that to a room of 1,000 young people in Egypt who come from a 10,000-year heritage of entrepreneurship. So the challenge, I think, is twofold, maybe 3. One is an attitudinal understanding that in the bottom-up world that we're talking about, we must be talking about co-authorship. This is not like even the Silicon Valleys did, me, and I'll get all the benefit and the rents that I have it. It is, there's a lot we bring to the table that might be of value to you, but more importantly, nobody knows you better than you. So why don't you first tell me what you're learning, what you're seeing, right? And this is not just in terms of day-to-day problem solving. Remember, the Middle East has never known landlines for all intents and purposes. Is it not possible that a brilliant mind might be able to teach us something about mobile capability going forward? So it's a sense of reciprocity, which I think is the first one. The second one from the government perspective is, what do you want to do? What is your role? If you think of this as a communications exercise like the Radio Free Europe of the next century, go home. Stop it. But if you ask yourself, like I was suggesting before, that there are in fact things government can do to open up the free flow of ideas, then it's very powerful. So let me give you a concrete example. A great startup from Egypt, great company, great entrepreneurs, really interesting idea, got discovered by a couple of venture capital investors who said in April, you got to be here by June, right? We're not going to do this over Skype. You're great, we'll fly you over, but you've got to be here by June because it's a competitive world and we're looking at other companies like it. All right? Guy said, great, April, no problem. Go down to our embassy to get a visa so they can get there by June. And the folks said, come back in August so we can interview you. If that's what we're going to do, let's not talk about it. Let's just stop talking about it. If we're not willing to say, here's a sense of priorities of how we can have impact, and we're doing it out of a sense of reciprocity, and we can do a couple of things which, frankly, are not that hard, even in this political environment, to show reality to it, that's great. Now, someone has told me, I can't prove this to you, someone has told me that in the State Department, there are 17 different groups dealing with entrepreneurship in the global markets. Okay, what does that mean? And what are the priorities in the agenda, and why are they there? But with that in mind, with those 3, which to me are not very complicated things in mind, I think the impact that we can make and governments there can make is phenomenal. It's where the bottom-up and the top-down engage in very, very interesting and highly relevant ideas for where the century is going. I'm sorry to reemphasize this, because there are lots of people on the ground who are fairly low in, or in, like Mike's case, are consultants, who get this, they understand this, but it's been difficult to get it into the decision-making realm.
Near the back there.
Thanks, Chris, and congratulations, Jonathan Rausch of Brookings
Great
Institution.
Great to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Can you talk a bit about the political challenges? I think a lot of people in the development world will say that it's great to have entrepreneurial energy and spirit and know-how, but you've also got to have functioning, stable political institutions, a certain limit on the amount of corruption, a certain amount of security, and stability and so forth, and that these are societies that are troubled on many of those fronts. Will politics snuff out entrepreneurship, or will entrepreneurship somehow revitalize politics? How do you see these forces intersecting?
You know, I'm a little bit of mixed minds of it because a couple things. I mean, one, there's absolutely no question this matters, right? To say that it's not relevant would be foolhardy. No matter how optimistic or hopeful I am about bottom-up going at it, these decisions in politics are very important. Now, a lot of the great entrepreneurs are working around both systems that are political in nature and even cultural in nature that they're wrestling. So, for example, this is a word many of you will know that I did not know until I did my research. All of us in Washington will appreciate it, but it's a word called wasta. And wasta is an Arabic word, or mostly a Lebanese word, that fundamentally talks about who do you know, right, so that you can get things done. And wasta is not only corrupting just in the idea that it's hard to get a job because you can't get a job, but once you're in there and you got wasta on top of you, you'll never rise. You're on top of people who are completely protected because they know people and that kind of a thing. Now, this is more of a cultural one, and I'll come back to the political in a second. But what is so interesting, which goes a little bit to the political thing, is the best quote that I think I received of many in my research was, in fact, from Gondor, who said there is no wasta in the internet. And the point that he was making is twofold. One, that things are moving so fast and so quickly that people are really able to take control and make impact, even in the challenges that they face the way that you described overall, because the technology just is moving faster than the institutions that are able to stand in their way. But secondly, it really changes people's outlook. So for example, when I was there, well, not last, but one of my last trips before the book got published was last winter, and LinkedIn just opened up offices in the Arab world for the first time. The interesting thing being that there are already 6 million Arabs on LinkedIn before they opened up an office. And this guy said the same thing. He said, look at a LinkedIn profile. There's no wasta on LinkedIn. You're as good as you say, you're as good as people view you, you're as good as your track record. These have huge ramifications. So I guess what I'm saying is that at one edge of it, I say to myself, what an amazing opportunity to watch, because this is so different than anything that's happened before. And the ramifications are not merely technically on the ability to move businesses, but in the way people think of each other. Add to that a Mubarak falls, and we can make all sorts of different conversations about whether the Arab risings are a win or a loss, a good thing or bad thing. The one thing is clear, that a new generation said, things that my parents told me were impossible are not impossible. Something really different then continues to happen in that part. But these institutions, I think, are making choices about the 21st century. And what I mean by that is that, you know, it's a very interesting discussion I write about in my book. Nitin Noraya, who is the dean of Harvard Business School, is a teacher of mine. And he knows as much as anyone I know about emerging markets. He said, you know, sometimes models happen that don't make sense to us, but they happen anyway. So I remember when I was in business school and when I was in the State Department, it was conventional wisdom that unless China had political liberalism, it would never grow. And obviously, you know, the jury's not out on China. It may be a big Japan. There could be a lot of issues. But no one can say that in the last 20 years, lack of political liberalism kept it from an amazing growth story in that period of time. So he says, isn't it a worthy question to ask? Is it possible that even countries that do certain things in a political liberalism way, they take a car moving 150 miles an hour maybe and have it going 120 miles an hour, it can still actually become a growth vehicle, at least relative to its region. Where I come out is really twofold. One is, I just don't know for how long. Because at the end of the day, all this transparency demands political liberalism, or at least a voice in some form, which again is unprecedented before. But secondly, and more importantly, it's one thing to say one is taking a car from 150 miles an hour to 120, but what if the car is going 20 miles an hour? And politicians and political systems keep it at 10. Not only do you risk losing a generation where you're really not sure if it can ever catch up because technology is moving so quickly, but one thing is for sure, this incredibly talented generation is the most mobile generation in the history of the world. They will leave. And so I don't have a crystal ball in the way that it plays out. But what I tell you, it's unbelievably real. The choices that are being made right now are unbelievably important. And in the meantime, this generation is doing anyhow. We're just going to have to see how that plays out overall.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Viola Ginger from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wanted to just follow up on that point, just go a little bit further. How influential do you find the entrepreneurs, the most successful entrepreneurs there being? How influential are they on their governments to the extent that it perhaps is needed to solve some of these problems? And are they interested in wielding that influence, or they just want to ignore the mess and go on their own way?
Let me caveat this as mostly an anecdotal response as opposed to one that I can back with data. So just take it from the window of what I've said. Most of the young people I meet are just moving as fast as they can and not trying to spend too much of it. A lot of the more accomplished or been at it longer folks get called in all the time for their advice. And by the way, all the top officials and the top global tech companies that are there are called in all the time for their counsel. And what becomes of it or what's happening with it, I just can't, I can't tell. Some of them come out and say, well, X and Y are saying the right things, it's going to take time. Some of the activity that has been seen, particularly in the GCC, is intriguing. But, so here's a perfect example, right? There was a news report this week that the GCC is exploring a unified visa. Well, that is pretty dang exciting. Do we think that Saudi Arabia really will buy in? Saudi Arabia is the country that most e-commerce people would love to be able to sell to as openly and freely as possible because it's such a large wealth and consumer market overall. I don't want to say no because I'm an entrepreneur and I always think maybe, but I don't know. And so it's a mix. I think some folks get called in and they want to be responsive, and there are individuals like the Mike Duckers of the world who really are trying to make a change. I think there's some people asking real questions, but it's unclear.
Yes.
Mohammed Islam in QTEL. A lot of the companies you've described are analogs to existing technology in the US. And Peter Thiel, when he describes his framework for startups in the ecosystem, he describes 1 to N tech companies that are essentially just analogs of existing technology, and 0 to 1 companies that really revolutionize technology for the entire world. So do you think those types of 0 to 1 companies can actually come out of the Middle East? Or do you think we're just going to have, instead of the Amazon for the entire world, we're just going to have the Amazon for Arab books coming out of the region?
It's a wonderful question and a very important question. And let's just say that Peter Thiel is a billionaire and I am not. But I disagree with him. There was a wonderful quote that I got in interviewing Sami Toukan, who built Maktub, on this very question. Because it's very interesting. I call these folks improvisers, and a lot of times they're called almost pejoratively copycats. Because somehow or other copycatting is viewed as just a constraining, get your money, whatever. But as Sami said to me, imagine, just play with me for a second. 7 years ago, a young man goes home to his parents, you guys who know emerging markets and Middle East in particular, and says, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm dropping out of college because I got this great idea for something called Facebook. It's never been done before. And this is going to be fantastic, and there are going to be 650 million users of it. This is a great idea. His parents would have never let him do it. His family would have thought he was insane. His friends might have laughed at him. There was no context for this kind of a thing like that, right? But all of a sudden, Yahoo buys Maktub for $200 million, and like lightning, there's young people saying it can happen here too. I think if you, look at China, right? What's one of the billion-dollar tech companies in China? Baidu, search engine. What's going to be a multi-billion-dollar company is Alibaba, e-commerce platform or whatever. What is one of the great IPO or transactions in Russia? Yandex, search engine. What is one of the great established multi-billion-dollar companies in Brazil? Mercado Libre, e-commerce. There's such low-hanging fruit in these regions where things are happening in early days and adoption is early. Why not do everything you can and have the success breed success? But let me tell you then about another entrepreneur that I know. How many of you know that the largest collection of fresh water on the planet is under the desert between Egypt and Libya? That is fundamentally being pumped by diesel fuel, highly unreliable in its delivery, and totally subsidized in the government until a year ago when the subsidies were pulled. All of a sudden, there's a young entrepreneur who says, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life. He's partnered with some folks at Princeton and his own technology and ideas, and he's now going, as opposed to a huge, large innovation in alternative fuel, he's actually doing very simple farm-by-farm pumping devices with solar power. He believes, and I love his ambition, he believes that he can increase arable land in Egypt by 25%. Now let's say it's a fifth of that. What kind of innovation is that, and what might be interesting about that that's very powerful? Hind Hobaika is a college swimmer from American University of Beirut who drove her crazy that when she competed in global competitions, the only training devices to do their pulse or heart rate were effectively running devices that were made waterproof. How can you train like this and look at your stuff like that? So she invented a very lightweight goggle with a Google Glass-like experience with a monitor here by which you can see that. She's outsourcing manufacturing to Asia and is about to launch big time in the United States in the next 6 months. I mean, again, we in the United States tend to start with the idea that if you're not having flying cars and that if innovation is not completely brand new, then it's somehow or other not as worthy. But you want to know something? When you have societies of hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, who have access to innovation for the first time, that is innovation in and of itself. And the multiplier new innovation that comes, some of it bottom up, some of it localized, I think opens up a really interesting question. If we were sitting here 20 years ago, would you have told me that Korea would be one of the great mobile device providers or consumer electronic juggernauts? It hasn't happened yet in software, interestingly enough, but we'll see.
We have time for one more. Yes, sir.
Jim Purical. I'm a major in the United States Marine Corps. So one of the holdbacks for the Indian economy also for the last decade or 2 decades also has been a lack of legal infrastructure. Do you see that changing also within the African economy also? And I see that as a big caveat or a big hindrance also to upcoming entrepreneurial.
Up to entrepreneurial and about it, God knows, capital, right?
Sure,
Money
exactly.
and everything else. So, you know, a lot of this starts with the feeling that, not the feeling, but the fact that emerging markets are not for the faint of heart. And what is interesting, and certainly, you know, I tend to talk about the Middle East like a gringo, which means I talk about it as one thing. And in fact, what's going on in one country is very different than the other countries. Obviously, what's happening in Damascus is different than what's happening in Dubai and so on. Some of the countries, while their rule of law is cumbersome and prohibitive and problematic to the ecosystem, there are actually ways that you know, in Egypt, for example, how to get amends if you feel like you're not getting your capital repatriated in a way that is actually much more opaque in China. I would make an argument that on a relative basis are already things that make, for all the problems they are, some interesting opportunities within some of the emerging markets there. Having said that, none of them are in the time zone of the opportunity that stands before them. There have been very exciting initiatives that have been done by NGOs and by just law firms here who have worked in partnership to try to rethink about how the ecosystem can work. But not unlike India, there has to be a will to do it at scale in a very powerful way. And it is a lingering and significant question that is the difference between interesting growth and something that could really refine society in a very powerful way.
Chris, what a great hour.
It was a great hour. Thank you for being here.
Startup Rising. I know Chris joins me in thanking Bob and CNAS for having us. Thanks to all of you for being here. Please join me in thanking Chris.
CNAS thinks of itself as an idea tank more than a think tank. And there's nothing more exciting than getting someone with a really awesome idea and just listening to them to riff for an hour. I'd like to thank both Chris and for Nate for making this such a great hour of ideas. And you know, to set up an event like this, it doesn't seem like a lot, but we have a very small team at CNAS. They were the ones who put all of this together and made this such an enjoyable event. So I'd ask you also to please join me in a round of applause and thank them for setting this up. I invite you to the table back there, and thank you all for coming.